Well, the Federal Reserve cut interest rates today by 0.5 point, which is an aggressive move when you consider how slowly they raised them post-pandemic. How this affects the economy, though, going into the election is a wild guess. Does this favor any one candidate? How is that going to affect your wallet? Well, we asked Tom Wheelwright. He is the author of many books and the host of the Wealthability podcast, and always my go-to when it comes to any economic advice. Full stop. We have been asking his breakdown of the candidates' plans since the Trump-Clinton election. We had him on our show then. We had him in the Trump-Biden election. He's batting 100 because his predictions hold up, you guys. So I spoke with him earlier today. Here is what he has to say about what we can expect for our finances if either candidate wins. Okay, Tom, so who should we start with? Let's start with the policies of Kamala Harris. What are the general policies that we should take away from her economic plan, and how will it affect us as consumers?
So her economic policy is very much tax the rich, and we have to define rich. So she's particularly focused on business owners as being rich. Her policies are quite anti-small business, and they're not, she says that she wants to tax rich, wealthy wage earners, but they actually take a much less of a hit than wealthy business owners. And the reason is because she's very focused on increasing the capital gains tax, which affects business owners, not employees. She's very much focused. She'd like to get rid of the 20% small business deduction. She'd like to add the net investment income tax to all earnings of businesses. So not just passive investments, but all business earnings. And she'd like to increase that to 5% from 3.8 to 5%. So what that means is, if you kind of simplify it down, she'd like capital gains rates to be 33% is her target for a capital gains rate. She would like a business owner to pay tax of 44.6%, and then a tax of 33% when they sell their business or when the business increases in value. So one of the other things that is we've not seen in a presidential candidate before now is this proposal to tax unrealized gains. Now, there is a big question whether that's constitutional, but let's ignore that for just a second. And let's say, well, what is it and what isn't it? What Vice President Harris would like to do is enact a minimum tax of 25%, so that, let's say that you had a lot of, and this is, by the way, this is in the Biden budget this year. So she's just adopting the Biden budget when it comes to the unrealized capital gains tax. In fact, a lot of her proposals, she's added a couple, but most of her proposals are straight from the Biden budget. So if you really want to look at, do a deep dive, you'd go to the Biden Green Book, which is the explanation of the budget. Basically, that's what the Green Book is. And so what we know from that is that she says that it would only be on people that have a net worth over $100 million. Somehow she calls that a billionaire's tax. Last I checked, you're not a billionaire if you have $100 million. But that's it's popular. But in any case, so that's what she's proposing is, let's say that you are, let's say, for example, you're Warren Buffett, okay? And truly a billionaire. And you're going, okay, so Warren Buffett doesn't have any income because his is all capital gains. And it's unrealized capital gains because he doesn't sell stocks, okay? So let's say he has zero income. But let's say his net worth, the value of his stock portfolio, went from 30 billion to 32 billion in a year. Okay, well, that $2 billion would be subject to basically a 25% tax. So that means he would have to sell stock in order to pay that tax. Okay, now what's interesting is it would appear he would be double taxed on that, because he would have an increase in he'd have the unrealized capital gains tax. Let's say this is 2025. So he starts the year with $30 billion. And I don't know what his net worth is. I'm sure it's north of that. But he starts the year at 30 billion. At the end of the year, he's at 32 billion, which means that for 2025, now on April 15th, he owes $500 million of tax. But he's going to sell stock in, say, January, February to pay that tax. Well, when he sells that stock, presumably he's going to pay tax on the capital gains at 33%. So he's going to pay tax twice on that increase in value. Now, one of the big questions is what happens if it goes to 32 billion in 2025 and then in 2026 it goes back down to 30 billion? Does he get the money back? Well, that causes havoc with the Treasury, right? And so what we've done historically is, no, you don't get it. You get a carryover. Well, do you get a carryover as a capital loss, as an ordinary loss? How does that work? So it's one of the challenges with this is, first of all, it won't stop at $100 million. It will come down eventually, because once it's the camel's nose in the tent. That's one of my biggest challenges with this policy. The original income tax, remember, 1913, only applied to the wealthiest individuals, only on a very small portion of their income. And now the average employee pays income tax. So we could see that over the years that would regress, right? It wouldn't be $100 million, and then next it'll be $10 million, next it'll be $1 million, and people go, well, even $1 million is a lot. Well, it is, unless you own a house in California and New York. There's very few people in California and New York that don't have a net worth of $1 million, that have any kind of income, actually live in a house, right? So then the question is, does it apply to your house? Does it apply to your business? Does it apply to your art? Does it apply to your precious metals? What does it apply to? It's a very difficult plan to work. And France tried it and they abandoned it.
But that assumes that people have something, which in this economy, so few people do. Now, one of the things I'll let you take a victory lap over is that during the Biden-Trump campaign, you talked about how they were both racing to give away money with all of these handouts and spend, and then that would lead to inflation. And that actually happened. So can you tell us about her plan, if there is such a thing, to reduce inflation, and how this spending has even caused it? Because inflation has led to a tax on everybody, even the lowest classes. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, that's a really important point, Natali. And understand that the worst tax there is inflation, because it is the most regressive tax. It hurts the low-income person more than it hurts the high-income person. And it really just devastates the fixed-income person, because they are reliant, their income doesn't change, from year to year appreciably, but now their prices go up so that their purchasing power goes down. It's a very heavy tax on the poor and the middle class. Here's my concern about the Biden-Harris tax plan. They're saying, well, but we're going to pay for our the taxes we spend. That's what they say. Now, the tax foundation would say it doesn't pay for it, but they say, well, it pays for it. Okay, let's say it does. Let's say they're right. And let's say we have a $5 trillion tax increase, and one group of people, and we have a $5 trillion tax decrease to another group. But let's look at those groups. So the increase is on people who are investors, meaning that they're not spending that money. They are investing it into real estate, into the stock market, into businesses. They're investing it. So you're pulling money out of the investment class and you're putting it into the consumer class. Well, where I think Biden and Harris have it wrong is they do not understand the definition of inflation. They propose that inflation means higher prices. That does not inflation. Inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. Okay, so if you take 5 trillion, because basically what you're doing is you're taking 5 trillion that is not being spent, because the investor class isn't spending the money. They're investing it, which is very different. They're not consuming it. You're taking that $5 trillion. Now you're flooding the economy with $5 trillion. Well, look what happened in 2020 and 2021 when we flooded the economy with first the Trump bill in the end of 2020 and then the Biden bill in March of 2021. And we basically put $4 trillion into an economy that was already heating up. Well, what we got was record inflation. That's where we got that 9, 10, 12% inflation, all right, was from too much money chasing too few goods. If you kind of shift over to the Trump side, you know, the detractors of Trump would say, well, but you're going to cause inflation with your tariffs. Now, I'm not a big fan of tariffs. However, they don't cause inflation because it's not more money chasing fewer goods, right? It's just higher prices. And there is a difference because you have a choice. If you decide, well, I'm going to buy in the US, okay, all right, now I don't have to pay those tariffs. If I'm going to buy from Vietnam versus China, I'm going to pay a lower tariff. So there is actually, it's a very different mechanics to it. And while it would probably result in higher prices overall, it's different from inflation in that it doesn't it's not self-perpetuating. Okay, because inflation is self-perpetuating.
It almost seems like a bribe, though, the way that the Democrats are promising all this money without a plan on how it will bring down costs, as if that will somehow bring down costs. In fact, on September 10th, she tweeted, "We need to bring down the cost of housing. My economic proposal includes $25,000 for first-time home buyers to help them with a down payment on a home. But of course, if I give someone money to buy something, that doesn't bring down the cost of that thing. So what are we missing?"
Well, let me give you a perfect example of that. In 2022, in August of 2022, Biden proposed, it was about to pass what he called the Inflation Reduction Act, which we actually know is the Inflation Enhancement Act. But that was that bill, right? That was the big solar electric car tax benefit bill. That's what that was. That extended the $7,500 credit for electric cars. The week it was announced, the electric car companies, including Ford, Tesla, and the others, raised their prices of their cars by, $7,500, shockingly. So now, I do have to run the math here, because if you give somebody $25,000, it will push the price up $25,000, but $25,000 will get them $125,000 of purchasing power. Remember, because if you have an 80% loan to value, then $25,000 down gets you a $125,000 house, basically. So while your house may go up from $100,000 to $125,000, those people will have more purchasing power. There's no question. It will push prices up. How much it will push them up, I don't think anybody knows. I'm sure that I suspect Tax Foundation and others have run those numbers. But it will actually give them a boost. I can't deny that it will give those people a boost. Obviously you're shifting. I mean, it's basically shifting payments, right, from one class of taxpayers to another. And that's a political discussion that we don't need to address here. But the fact is that you've got Harris so she wants to decrease taxes on certain things. Like she wants to eliminate taxes on tips, just like Trump does. She wants to give them $25,000 new home buyers, which probably would help them, frankly. It probably would, net.
That will benefit those people in the short term, right. But in the long term, it won't if we have another housing crisis and everybody's property value falls, then we're all hurting. So it seems like there were no lessons learned from the housing crisis of 2008.
Well, I will say neither candidate has learned very many lessons here, because on the Trump side, we want to turn to the Trump side. He not only wants to continue the 2017 tax law, which, by the way, Harris wants to increase the corporate income tax as well, which is probably the worst of her proposals. Because remember, an increase in corporate taxes affects everybody with a 401k, IRA, pension plan. I mean, it affects most of middle America. That's really who gets hurt. By the way, if you have the billionaires having to sell off stock to pay that tax, guess who that hurts? That also hurts your pension plans. So if I get back to that just for a second, Warren Buffett recently sold a large part of his Apple stock. And the reason he gave for selling is that he expects capital gains taxes to go up. That's why he sold his most valuable asset that he loves the company the most. He sold it because he thinks capital gains taxes are going up. So that's I think we need to listen to Warren Buffett on that one. On the Trump side, he wants to reduce corporate taxes. So he wants to reduce them even more, 20% or down to 15%. That's probably the best of his proposals. He wants to eliminate tax on Social Security, which is frankly a terrible idea because that money goes directly to the Social Security Trust Fund. He wants to eliminate taxes on tips, another terrible idea. And he just announced that he wants to bring back the state and local income tax deduction, which is a terrible idea, okay, because it's a very expensive and only helps rich people. So there are things, people think, well, I have good and bad here. No, I have bad and bad. It's just which one's worse. Now, Trump very much favors the business owner, okay? And his tax proposals are all business favorable, where Harris's proposals are all consumer favorable. And I think that's a very simple way to look at it is, if you're a consumer, you probably like Harris's proposals, absent the inflationary aspects of it. You probably like it. If you are a business owner, if you're an investor, you're going to like Trump's proposals because he wants to maintain the 20% business tax deduction, flow-through tax deduction. He wants to lower the corporate income tax rate. He wants to bring back bonus depreciation, full bonus depreciation. He wants to make research and development fully deductible. So those are very pro-business. He's just, like Harris, is unfortunately pandering to the general population when it comes to things like not taxing tips and not taxing Social Security.
One of the things I would like President Trump to address is why he started the COVID handouts. They were not based on needs, and economists were saying this is going to flood the market with money and we will have record-breaking inflation, and that in fact happened. Right. Now, of course, the Biden administration just kept on spending, but President Trump has never answered for why he did that in the first place. So I would like to see an answer that seems to address the cause of inflation. He also hasn't talked about reducing spending on foreign wars. Neither candidate has. So do we even have a vote on those things? Am I correct?
No, that's very fair. You don't. I haven't seen anybody talking about the defense budget. Okay, we actually are very low in our defense spending. We're spending money on foreign wars, but we're not building up our military, which is, I think, a big concern when you have China doing what it's doing in the South China Sea, when you have Russia doing what it's doing, and you have the China-Russia alliance, you have BRICS. That's Brazil, Russia, China, India, South Africa, and 20 other nations that want to create their own currency that is backed by some type of a commodity, so that it's more stable current, so it gives it some stability, so that they're not fully reliant on the US dollar. So I would love to hear more discussion of actually the economy. There was, unfortunately, in the debate between the two candidates, there was no discussion of the economy, which I thought was a huge disservice by the commentators, by the interviewers, to the American public. And the world public, frankly, because the world relies on the U.S. economy. Europe sells to the U.S. Mexico sells to the U.S., Canada sells to the U.S., China sells to the U.S. Everybody's relying on the U.S. economy. But when you see some of these proposals that would have a big negative impact, the Tax Foundation, for example, suggests that Harris's proposals would lead to a decrease across the board in the economy by 2 to 3% across the board, a decrease in jobs by about 800,000. Now, Trump's proposals would decrease jobs by about 400,000. So both of them actually bring down the economy. So it'd be nice to actually see the candidates start focusing on, rather than what do we do to get you to vote for me, what do we do to actually help the economy bring down the deficit, which is headed towards another. I was just reading that by in the next 20 years, we could add another $22 trillion to the deficit, where our interest expense will be more than our defense spending. Now, that's a scary thought.
It's unusual that today is the first rate cut that we get of the year. Normally in a presidential election year, we get several. So why do you think that's happened? And now that we have rate cuts, what do you think will happen to the economy?
Well, the Fed says that they have two jobs. One is to maintain unemployment at a low level, and the other is to keep prices down. They do not take on, they say, whatever the government's going to do, we're going to counterbalance what the government does. That they're basically, they call themselves the balance to the federal government. So when Harris or Trump put all this money into the economy, their job is to reduce inflation. Well, the way they're going to do that is to raise interest rates. So I think a lot of it's going to depend on, we'll see minor rate cuts over the next, 3 to 6 months for sure. We'll see a couple of small rate cuts. But I think they're going to be very cautious, because what we don't know is, we don't know who the president's going to be. We also don't know who's going to control Congress, because you have a very different animal. Let's say the Democrats control all of Congress. Well, what they want to do is they want to flip the Supreme Court on day one. They want to flip the Supreme Court by putting in term limits, retroactive term limits. They want to eliminate the filibuster, which means that they can pass any bill they want if they had a majority. And of course, they're going to only do that if they have a majority going in. So the chances of that filibuster going down the tubes, if the Democrats sweep, is, I think, pretty high. If the Republicans sweep, you're going to see a lot of emphasis on eliminating, frankly, federal agencies, cutting regulations. You're going to see a lot of emphasis on, of course, they're going to be looking at the tax side, but they're looking at it from a business side. I don't think the deficit gets better, frankly, under either choice. I think frankly, the best bet is probably you have Republicans controlling part of the government and Democrats controlling the other part of the government, and they actually have to work together. When the two sides have to work together, we tend to get much better results than when one party is completely in charge.
Well, Tom, thank you so much for your time. I always go to you when I'm looking for guidance on the economy. You're one of my favorite financial experts. You can follow Tom as well. Head on over to wealthability.com. He's got a great podcast. He's got great books on helping to empower you with your personal wealth. So check him out. Tom, thanks again. And, election year, we're going to cross our fingers and hope for the best for everyone.
Absolutely. Thanks, Natalie. It'll be fun. It'll be a ride.